Hello, everyone. I'm sorry, but because we are starting late, we had a few technical issues, but we are ready to go now. My name is Nicolás Aguila. I'm one of the board members of YSI, and I was also part of the writing team that wrote the report on early career challenges that we presented last year. We thought about that report as a conversation starter, so I'm extremely happy that I'm thankful to YSI management that they put together this second event to continue a conversation on some of the challenges that we face as young scholars, as well as starting new ones. And let me just say that in the group that wrote the report, we had people coming from all over the world, and we realized that people that come from the global south share a lot of issues regarding being a young scholar and in particular trying to do new economic thinking. But there were also important differences in terms of regions. So we thought that it was great to frame our issues as something that we all share, but also going into more detail about the specific regional things that we face. So I'm super happy that we are starting to have these conversations on regional challenges. And we are going to start with the African continent, as you all know. So without further ado, let me just introduce Professor Tinashe Nyamunda, who is Associate Professor at the University of Pretoria and a long-standing friend of YSI and the best person to lead the session. So Tinashe, the floor is yours now. You're muted, Tinashe.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Nicolás. And good afternoon to everyone. It's a pleasure to once again be part of this session, discussing with these wonderful people the challenges to being an African scholar. So it's good to be in the company of Fiona and Richard once more, like we did last year in November. It was quite an interesting session that we had. But anyway, without any further ado, we're going to make this session very interactive. It's not going to be like a formal academic discussion where a person gives a 10 or 15-minute presentation. Really, the format that we've taken is one where we have a collective discussion and interactive conversation, right? So if you feel like raising a question at any point, you can either type it in or just come through and raise that question, because really we want this to be more of a conversation where we discuss all of these challenges that African scholars face, right? So although we might have a point at which we are going to really be discussing question and answers, but this should be an ongoing thing. So we're just going to start with my colleagues, Fiona and Richard, saying something about, the challenges of being an African scholar for 5 or so minutes. I'll also share my own challenges after they've done so. And then we just open it up for like a free-flowing discussion, because these are issues that affect all of those people who are in this panel, I can imagine. So let's have fun with this. So Fiona, would you like to go first?
Sure. I thought maybe Nicolás was going to go first to give an input from the report, but whatever. No?
Well, no, it's like we're going to just continue with the conversation today.
Okay, sure. Yeah, happy to jump in. Thanks, Tinashe. Great to be together again. Greetings to all the participants. Yeah, looking forward to the conversation this afternoon, well, afternoon for me here in Johannesburg. I guess different times of the day for people elsewhere. Yeah, so I think, I see this afternoon's conversation as really picking up and building on the conversations which we had late last year, drawing on the very useful report which YSI put out, which really highlighted multiple problems, or not necessarily not problems, but some of the challenges facing young scholars across the world, and which we had discussions on then. And it was recognized in the report, as well as in the discussions, that there's some common denominators in these problems or challenges, but there's also variation in context, and in particular the need to kind of give more attention to the specificities in the global south, and particularly in the case of Africa. So I think this today's conversation is really important to pick up on that and zoom in on some of the specificities within the continent. I think many of the challenges which were identified apply to young scholars, PhD candidates, and post-PhD young researchers in Africa as well. So when we think about some of the things which were picked up in the report around financial constraints, around kind of multiple competing priorities, so the need to finish the PhD within a short enough period of time, whilst also publishing, while also presenting, while also looking for grants, while also networking, and how to balance that, as well as the kind of psychosocial pressures and the particular aspects relevant to young women scholars and so on. I think all of those apply. There's none of those which I would say are not relevant in the African context, and many of them would perhaps be even more intensive and pronounced challenges for young scholars in the African context. I think it's also important to recognize at the outset the heterogeneity across the continent in the issues that we're talking about. So obviously our session this afternoon is framed around young African scholars. The context varies a lot by university, by country, by region, and so on. So some of the challenges facing young scholars in Algeria are going to be different from in Mauritius and Niger and Namibia and so on, because the contexts are so different. And perhaps that's some of what we can pick up in the discussion. But I guess it's also to build on the commonalities and to always remind scholars that what might seem to be an individual challenge or difficulty is without a doubt shared. Of course, people have, there's uniqueness in people's own individual circumstances, but some of the common challenges are shared ones, and some of the solutions are also shared ones. So, I mean, I think maybe I just thought, in these opening comments, just to perhaps mention, some of the particular issues, I think, for young African scholars that maybe we can pick up further in the discussion this afternoon. I think for the doctoral journey, the PhD, there's always choices around whether to do this at home, in one's home country, in another country within the continent, or whether to do it abroad. And all of those, of course, have pros and cons. And for young scholars who have done their PhDs abroad, whether then to aim to work there or to return to the home country, I think is one of the kind of pressing choices. And I think associated with that, and perhaps some of the issues which we can also explore, is in some cases negative stereotypes and perceptions of PhDs not done abroad, depending on the country context and so on, and how to overcome those, because of course there's no direct correlation with quality based on where a PhD was undertaken. So I think how to deal with those in one's own career and applying for jobs and so on, and sometimes the privileging of study abroad. Then I think some of the other challenges which apply in many contexts is around facilities. Of course, there's a lot of variation. In some cases, facilities are world-class, if we could use that term, even if a bit critically. In other cases, young scholars battle even with internet access, subscriptions to journals, data access, and so on. In some cases, there's also challenges with supervision, of course, not unique to Africa, but I mean, anecdotally, we hear of, in many cases, people struggling with maybe supervisors being busy with other work and consultancies or whatever, and sometimes having less attention. Of course, all of these things I'm mentioning don't apply across the board, but it's just mentioning some of the issues. I think for scholars interested in particular in heterodox economics, again, it's quite uneven. but it's not particularly strong across the continent as a whole. There's pockets of strengths and niches of interest and so on. But I think it's not as well developed generally as in at least some institutions abroad. So I think in many cases for scholars who are maybe questioning some of the received orthodoxies and so on can end up feeling quite kind of isolated because some of the things maybe don't make sense. We want to challenge them, but there's not always that supportive heterodox community. So yeah, let me maybe leave it there, and yeah, I'm sure we can explore some of these further. And maybe towards the end, I will also just like to share some information on some specific opportunities that my center or that I'm part of that we have open at the moment for young African scholars.
Thank you, Fiona. I think that was quite informative, and you really touched on the nerve of some of the issues that we face on the continent. Richard?
Thank you, Tinashe, and thank you, Fiona. Thank you for having me, really. It's good to be here. Always exciting to be talking about the issues and the challenges that face African scholars, not least working with YSI around that. So thanks to YSI too for putting this together. And then as a way of starting, I think Fiona has nicely, giving an overview of what the problems are, and these are conversations that we've had before, and we've often talked about. I suppose she's also done really nicely in contextualizing those problems, but also not just dwelling on the problems, but opening up conversations and context and angles and areas in which solutions can start to be discussed, or ways to navigate those problems can start to be discussed. So thank you very much for that. Makes our jobs a lot easier here. And so I think what I'll probably do is to just highlight one particular area that you touched upon, Fiona, after which I suppose the conversations and the questions that would come on the back of that can then touch upon specific issues. And I think it is to do with where the young African researcher kind of starts from and his trajectory. And so that can kind of help us to, see where the problem might be, or contextualize it, I would say, and upon that start to think about ways to address it and ways to bring a balance. And I suppose for me it is thinking about it around what's the root of inquiry, of every academic inquiry. And I think it starts from the problems. You start to look around the problems around us. The way thought systems are linear, right? The way in which activities happen around us, the kind of problems that African scholars face would very much, I think, shape the kind of issues that they want to deal with. And we find that very, very often. Issues of structural challenges in our society, issues of poverty and underdevelopment, issues of you find that in different areas, different angles, whether it was gender and different age groups and different groups. And that's, I think, there's a tendency to think about problems from that point, which then puts you on a path that's almost deterministic in terms of the kind of research that you want to do, that you are interested in doing, the kind of questions you want to ask, and the way in which you investigate those questions. This is broadly speaking. There would be exceptions. Then require that you visit very heterodox approaches, very You want to draw upon history. You want to draw on, you want to look at how society works and why are these problems playing out this way within our own context. So there's a tendency to look at it in that way, which in many cases would not appeal to very mainstream universities and institutions in the West. And so that's a challenge in itself. So one way to kind of navigate that, which we're going to be talking about, is finding specific areas that your kind of questions can be explored, or institutions that are interested in the kind of questions that we want to ask, right? So that's one thing I would say around that. But we also know, and I think Fiona started to talk about, the using heterodox approaches, political economy, to understand the problems that we face. And for economists, it makes your inquiry not very appealing to most mainstream institutions abroad. So it's something to be conscious of and start to think about how to navigate that. One thing that might be necessary to talk about is, having chosen an institution, having found an institution that is kind of recipient to the kind of ideas and methods of inquiry that we want to pursue, it can limit you, especially in certain contexts. And so maybe you pursue, if you want to, if you're doing economic inquiry, economic thought, you're using methods that are not mainstream, there's a tendency for people, even within the continent, to think that you're not economist enough, right? And so this is for economists in particular. So it's necessary to think about ways to kind of navigate that, how to address that. But a bigger problem, and I'll stop there, a bigger problem that this brings to the fore is the tendency to then continue to depend on Western and foreign knowledge for certain areas and for certain research areas on the continent, for certain problems that you're thinking about and you're working on. And these are all challenges. As I suppose I'm trying to string together different angles of the problem so that we can open up areas of discussion, questions, and things to talk about going forward, and to make this very rich. So I'll stop there. I suppose there'll be a lot of questions. I'm quite happy to expand on some of the things that we've talked about, and to hear everybody's thoughts as well.
All right. Thank you, Richard. Yes. So where do you begin when you've had such brilliant interventions from your colleagues? But anyway, I'm just going to pick on a few points that I was thinking about as well, and jotting some points down. One of the biggest challenges that I have observed about being an African scholar is that of acceptance, right? Whenever people think about prestige, the first thing that comes to mind is an Ivy League university. Did you go to Harvard, right? Did you go to Princeton? Or a Russell Group university? Were you at Cambridge, Durham, Oxford? So if you're going to go to a conference, apply for a grant, submit a paper, you have to work that extra hard for you to be accepted, because you are coming from a university, frankly, that nobody really cares to know about, right? So the question of acceptance is a really important one. And the idea that an African university can produce really good scholars is something that we need to emphasize, so that we make it clear that a brilliant kid from an African university can produce just as good a thesis as a kid who's coming out of Harvard. They may have had different opportunities, different resources, but the point is that given a chance, they may surprise you. So that's, for me, a critical point. Another important point is the problem of trust, right? When you're looking at these disciplines, to borrow the point that Richard made earlier about Western knowledge systems, what you're going to discover is that a lot of the disciplines that we, call our expertise to come from are foreign in origin in many ways. So if you're going to trace the origins of economics as a discipline, right, you're going to discover it began in the 19th century in Europe, the same with history. And in that context then, when universities, right, or so-called modern knowledge institutions were established, they tended to follow the kind of conventions that had been established elsewhere. And when you look at those conventions, those are the conventions as these universities and other higher education systems developed. These are the conventions that became entrenched in terms of the knowledge systems that we use to teach students. Now, what happens in a context where, as an African scholar, as we think, you've been taught to be analytical and to think. You come up, you use the context of your own country of origin to rethink certain conventions. Are people going to trust your knowledge about it? Or they're going to think it's inferior? How can this person come and challenge these theories that have been there from the 17th century? Who are they to challenge it? We know what economics is. We know what history is. And therefore, if they are going to talk about kukia, who are they to tell us? What is that even to talk about? So there's an important question of trust. Then there's also a question of what research really means for different people in different parts of the world. From my experience, we've got a number of Africanists, right? People trained in very big institutions in the West, or let's just say the global North. I think that's a more appropriate term. And they want to study Nigeria, South Africa, Zimbabwe, and they're informed by a lot of these conventions, right? So all they simply need to do, in some instances, I'm not saying that this is what everybody does, is to come to your case study and test these conventions to see how they differ from what you know. But what happens if you're an African scholar, born and bred in a certain place, and you want to study things that you're involved in on an everyday basis, right? In many instances, for you, something that is exceptionally fascinating to somebody else is the ordinary and the everyday. But how do you research that? And how do you put that in a language that's academically acceptable? So one of the major challenges I've seen is one of acceptance, is one of trust, is one of when you're researching what methodologies are accepted by those people who control the big journals. Is your knowledge good enough despite the fact that to you is the ordinary and the everyday? Or is the methodology that somebody is imposing on you the one that you should use? So whether it's a question of ethics or it's a question of interviewing people, I mean, you're going to interview your mother, your father, your brother, a person who grew up in your own neighborhood to get the same kind of information that somebody coming from elsewhere needs to get. Sometimes you even know this in your mind. Of course, you will interview to get certain perspectives, but those are the kinds of challenges that we face. Another important problem that Africans face, and it's related to all of the above, is that of gatekeeping, right? So if you're going to publish in the Journal of Economics or in the American Historical Journal or in African Studies, whatever big journal there is out there, who has decided that that journal is big, right? Who has decided the impact factor? And on what basis? We all agree that we must have a conversation, a global conversation about whatever important issues, and we must agree that these outlets are important to have these conversations in. But we can't ignore the fact that at times, the work that's coming out of Africa from African scholars is usually put aside. Partially, this has to do with perceptions about the quality of the work, But at the same time, you can't also ignore the fact that perhaps a person who's editing a journal would prefer a paper that's coming from their student who's going to cite them in their own paper, right? And all of those points are particularly important. So the question of gatekeeping, although I can see quite a lot of transformation taking place at the moment, is a particularly interesting one to consider. The other challenge that we face is that we must acknowledge the diversity of the African continent. We rarely do this because normally when Western academics are thinking of Africa, well, this is an unfair point, but there are some people who, when they're thinking of Africa, they're not considering the diversity of the continent and the diversity of the challenges that we face. So, for instance, if there are challenges to do with how to confront issues of racial and other transformation issues in South Africa, perhaps there are issues of lack of acceptance of diversity, of getting whether they are white scholars or scholars from other countries in Zimbabwe. So you might have problems that are of a different nature, but problems that also need to be addressed in different ways as well. So we need to acknowledge that Africa in itself is quite diverse, and the challenges that African scholars face are also quite diverse. So if a scholar is working perhaps in Botswana or maybe in South Africa, perhaps in terms of their remuneration, they are better off compared to somebody working, say, for instance, in Ethiopia or in Zimbabwe. They have a different basis of resources, different remuneration, and therefore the kind of things that they can do, given the platforms that they have, are also very different. So there are numerous challenges that African scholars face. I cannot exhaust them at this particular point, but these challenges are also quite diverse depending on the continent. What I want to really draw on is the fact that there are certain connections to these kinds of challenges. I just wanted to point out the fact that there are diversity of African countries, there are diversity of challenges, but there are numerous others which are associated with the continent as a whole, which have to do with acceptance, which have to do with trust, which have to do with gatekeeping, which also have to do with access to resources. I'll give an example of doing research. Often enough, you'll find a Western scholar doing research on different African countries, particularly because they have access to the Q archives, right? If they're a historian, they have access to, well, I think it's closed now, former Bodleian Library at Oxford University, Rhodes House. I don't know what it's called now. Or they have access to the Bank of England. If you get into those institutions, you are going to get documents, right? Primary documents and some data on all of these African countries. But if you go into perhaps the Central Archival Repository in South Africa, you are likely to find information that has to do particularly in South Africa without that very strong or significant imperial link, or without, too much information on multilateral connections. So the kind of information you have access to is also severely limited. So that gives the other scholar a significant advantage. So resources, the point from which you're conducting your research from, the kinds of universities that you attended, where you got your degrees from, perceptions about the quality of African scholars, all of these are some of the challenges that I can identify off the top of my head that African scholars face. Now, what I'm just trying to do is to open up avenues and imaginations for conversations. I'm not going to go on and on or carry on. I just want us to come in and have a conversation about this. What elements of the discussion that we've had really speaks to you the most, right? Because that's what this platform is about. How best do we confront it? What has been your own personal experiences? What is it that Fiona has made reference to, or Richard has made reference to? What is it that particularly affects you, and how do you think we should confront it? Or even if you raise it as a question, I think this is why INET and YSI created this platform, so that we could have these kinds of conversations and bring them to a situation whereby we can all talk about them, no matter what country we come from. We identify these different challenges. So what I'm just going to do for now, I don't know if my colleagues want to add a final word. before we open up the conversation. If you do, this is the opportunity to do so. But please, whoever wants to come in and raise any kinds of questions, I want you to just go ahead and do so. All right.
I'm happy to add, but if there are questions or comments, I can also stand back while those go on.
I think please go on, Fiona, while I'm also just looking to see if there's anything that has been typed into the chat box. So
sure. Well, let me chip in and add while you collate those. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So you know, I think some of the comments which all three of us have made, and I see some of the points also coming through in the chat, are around, you know, how to deal with these negative perceptions and so on, which I think have a range of sources. I mean, in some cases, it's just pure racism. Let's call it out for that. And, you know, yes. Particular perceptions, or in some cases, it's you know, there might be stereotypes that, okay, there's sort of soft areas of research, whatever that means, but soft areas of research which are well done, but not the more quantitative stuff or whatever, you know. So there's variations to this. You know, in other cases, I mean, there obviously are variations in institutional quality and in resources and so on. And, you know, those are realities that we have to kind of grapple with. So in terms of how to deal with these perceptions and so on, you know, I would think it through in two levels. I mean, one is this kind of the systemic level, and how do we collectively, you know, combat unfounded negative perceptions and so on, you know, through organizations and initiatives and so on, which I think is an ongoing process. Then I think for individual young African scholars, it's fine to talk about that kind of systemic change, but it's things which people need to navigate in the here and now in their own lives and careers. And, you know, it's one thing to recognize these stereotypes and so on, but the reality is that you need to get ahead with getting jobs and publishing and so on. So, I mean, I think it is really important to publish in as good journals as one can get into. And this goes for people across the world. It's the same advice I would give to any young scholar. You know, in some cases there might be a desire to maybe build up a fledgling journal which you have a personal connection to and so on, and to submit research to that as kind of you know, a part of that project of building up a journal. I think it is a bit of a self-sacrifice to do so. It might be selfish advice, but I would say, you know, for career advancement, you really want to publish in as good a journal as possible. We can critique journal rankings, and there's different rankings out there, but I think, you know, any scholar at any stage of their career probably wants to get into, you know, as high ranked and prestigious a journal as possible. I think collaborations are also important, you know, within and in between African scholars and between scholars in Africa and elsewhere. And obviously those collaborations need to be, you know, mutually respectful, mutually beneficial, a two-way collaboration, which you know, people can bring different strengths to the table and so on. But I think collaborations are really important, particularly for young scholars. Again, it's an advice I would give to, you know, to any young scholar in any country. But I think in particular, if somebody is, you know, maybe has not studied abroad and is based in an African country and so on, those collaborations can also be, you know, helpful ways of getting into good journals and so on. Attending conferences. Obviously there's, you know, practical things of finances and so on, but I think these are all important not to become too insular. So I think it's something we need to guard against, right? So whilst on the one hand we can, you know, critique these imbalances and the unfairness of them and so on, I think we should also guard against becoming too isolated and too insular and saying we're not going to care about all of that, and we're just going to do our own thing here. So that networking, collaborations, getting to the best, we can critique what is best, but I mean, we know what are the most prestigious conferences in our field and so on. Those things also do matter. And maybe the last thing, which I would just say before moving on, I don't want to take too much time already, is that, you know, we can also look at how to turn some of the challenges into opportunities. So we know that Africa is an under-researched continent, and that, you know, for most topics that we're going to look at, I mean, with a few exceptions, maybe conflict economics or whatever, but I mean, in general, whether we're looking at macro or labor or whatever, Africa is probably the most under-researched continent. Even when we do our literature reviews, sometimes we can't find a lot of papers and so on. That is a fantastic opportunity. It's research gaps waiting to be filled, waiting for us to contribute to. So when you're looking at a particular topic, there might be like 30 papers on that in a European context or a North American context, and maybe 10 or 15 of them in a Latin American context or an Asian context, and maybe 1 or 2 in Africa. That's a great opportunity. It's easier in some ways to make an original contribution to knowledge, and an original contribution which goes beyond just replication to the African context, but extending it, you know, to take account of those specificities in ways that are also interesting for the rest of the developing world. So where there are those knowledge gaps, those are knowledge gaps that are waiting for us to fill them.
You're muted, Tinashe.
Tinashe, you're still muted.
Yes, I keep forgetting these technological issues. Yeah. No, I was just mentioning that the point about opportunities is very important. I mean, we've been talking about challenges for the better part of the conversation, but there are opportunities that are certainly there. And perhaps we need to shift the conversation towards looking at opportunities, although it is important to identify these kinds of challenges. I suppose what I could add to what you were saying, Fiona, is that while it is important to acknowledge the fact that the top journals tend to be in Europe, and certainly any serious scholar would want their work to feature there, we must also acknowledge the platforms that we have created locally. And the only way we can make those outlets viable is if we contribute to them, if we recognize the fact that they are also important outlets. That is the only way that we can get even scholars from the global north to want to contribute to what we have and to listen to what we have to say. In any case, if you look at citation indices, I've noticed from a number of publications that focus on this that they rarely cite African scholars unless that African scholars is really magnanimous, is really huge. So there's an extent to which the politics of knowledge production has to do with who is listened to, right? Whose point is considered more important. And we can't ignore existing prejudices. I mean, the 21st century had given the impression that the world is becoming more accepting of diversity until such unfortunate conflicts as what's happening in Ukraine reveal that certain prejudices still do exist, right? That because of one's skin color, you can be excluded from certain opportunities, privileging one with a different skin color or with a different country of origin. So all of those points are certainly important. But while those challenges are there, I think the critical point that Fiona is making here is that they also present opportunities, and these are opportunities that we certainly must take up and, you know, take up bravely as well. Richard, there are a few questions there, but I'll come to them after your intervention.
Yes, thank you. And I think I would even start to pick on some of the questions.
Yes.
You know, because I think you and Fiona have very well elaborated on the points that have been made, and there is no need repeating those. I suppose one of the questions that's been asked is, for me to elaborate on some of the challenges that I think that I touched upon and how to navigate those. I suppose it is around what institutions. So when I was finishing my PhD, a big challenge was really, where do you go from here? Having been in a very heterodox economics department. And so it took me time. I'd made close to 50 applications before I realized and I didn't get one interview. Before I realized you're never, ever going to get into the departments and the universities you are applying to, right? And that was a wake-up call. Having had a conversation with my supervisor that, hey, I've applied for so many institutions and I'm not getting any interviews. He then asked, what institutions are you applying to? What departments are you applying to? So I suppose the thing to highlight there is to do a bit of research on the university, on the department, on the researchers whose work kind of resonate with yours and that you can work with. That's very important. And once you're able to do that, you'll find departments in the global north, universities in the global, of course, very few, but every now and then you find some researchers that are very much open to working or to investigating the kind of questions that you're investigating and are open to pursuing those questions with you. And so you can collaborate. It comes back to what Fiona started to talk about in collaborating. So in identifying those, do definitely reach out and say, this is how your work resonates with theirs, and this is what you're interested in, what you think you can collaborate on. I'm at Cambridge, and the college that I'm in is one of, I would say, literally one of the most liberal colleges in the university, and that was because I was able to see what questions they're interested in, see what things kind of resonate with them, and where the kind of questions that you're asking will be acceptable. And that also helped in the application process, looking for opportunities there. So that's one thing that we must do as a way to navigate the challenges. And I'll quickly just add, I think for postdocs, for PhD students who have done their PhDs in the global south, there are postdoc opportunities as well in the global north with the same elements that I've just described, which you can reach out to. Then we must then realize, and that applies to journals, right? We've talked about journals. So some journals are very much, top-rated journals are very much sympathetic to the kind of questions that we're asking in the global south, the kind of research methods that we're using. By all means, submit to those and get published in high-ranking journals, as they're very necessary for your promotion and moving up the academic ladder. The other thing I've got to say, and this I'll try and make this brief so other people can talk, is there has to be an awareness of these things that we're talking about. And I think this is why this forum is really good. This conversation is really good, because if you understand that there are challenges, there are whether structural and otherwise, and how to navigate that, it puts you in a place where you then strike a balance that helps you tell yourself you're actually good enough, right? It is the structural challenges that have become impediments to wherever you are rising to the top. That helps you, not ask yourself questions whether, you're actually that bad for being where you are if you want to move. And so that's then also understanding these issues, and then you're able to then propose broader solutions to those same questions. So I'll leave that here, and I'd say that definitely would help in moving forward.
I'm seeing a question from Davina here. I think you partially answered it. How can we better signal our quality, either on the job market or as an early career researcher, beyond seeking to attach yourself to named institutions or networks? Or are these necessary signaling conditions? So, can you be a good scholar without having gone to Cambridge, or taken a fellowship at Oxford, or won a Rhodes Mandela scholarship or fellowship. Perhaps, I don't know, Fiona, maybe I could ask this question to Richard, being an African scholar who is working in the United Kingdom. What are your experiences? Do you feel like, without having made such connections, if you had not obtained your degree from London, your PhD, and you had written the same kind of work at Ibadan University, right, which to me is one of the exceptional universities on the continent, not just in West Africa, but what would that have meant in terms of your opportunities in securing a position at a prestigious university such as Cambridge?
Well, I think it definitely makes a difference, and that's, you know, on the back of the gatekeeping that we're talking about, the kind of negative perception of work that is coming from the African continent. So it does make a difference that, you know, if you have a degree from the global north, but if you haven't, I think it then comes back to the point that I made earlier, that it doesn't mean that you are definitely, you know, you're doing less quality work, and you'd have to continue to try and build collaboration. As I said, there would be people in the global north, they're asking the same questions with the same research methods that can help. But if you also don't even want to, people who know would see a good work and know that this work is good. And so it should not in any way undermine your potential or ability to put your foot forward. You want your work to speak to the solutions, or to speak as solutions to the problems that we have identified. And I think by all means, continue to put your results, your findings forward to tackle the problems on the continent. I think even within the continent, because of the growing conversation around local knowledge, there would be opportunities to have your work showcased and your solutions put forward. That's what I would say to that.
All right. Well, thank you, Richard. I think there are a few questions, but I'm not going to dwell much on them in the interest of time. I'm going to ask Fiona to come in here, but I'm going to also ask one or two questions to you, Fiona, as part of your contribution. I'm just curious, from your experience, about the questions of, one, massification in African, particularly South African universities, and two, quality. To what extent would some people in the global north have a point in saying, our students are better prepared for university than some of the people that we find on the African continent? I would argue that this is just my own personal opinion, that we need to appreciate the context before we make such conclusions. But in any case, I just wanted you to speak to that, and then also to the question of access to whether there are grants locally. I know South Africa is more privileged in that sense than numerous other African countries, but also opportunities for Africans to compete for such grants at an international level. If you could also include that in your, in whatever you want to contribute.
Thanks, Tinashe. The issues around massification that you raised, well, perhaps I would shift it a little bit, to talk about resources and capacity. And the reality is that in many institutions in different parts of the continent, there has been a hollowing out of higher education over an extended period of time. Probably it's something we need an entire session on, but we can go back to structural adjustment programs from the early 1980s, which saw deliberately huge cuts in expenditure on higher education for both fiscal and non-fiscal reasons. And many of the institutions which had been kind of the pride of Africa saw, a decimation of staff numbers and research funding and so on. So we can't pretend that those sort of things don't affect quality. And again, it comes back to, kind of the systemic issues, and then how, as an individual young scholar, does one navigate one's own career path within those kind of structural constraints. So trying to contribute to changing them, as well as, making your own way as best one can. So just in terms of kind of opportunities, I wanted to speak at two levels. First, broadly, and then I wanted to mention some specific opportunities available right now. So in terms of opportunities, I spoke earlier about kind of the research gaps that are out there waiting to be filled, and original contributions which are available to be made. Let's put it like that. I think for African scholars, there's a benefit of local contextual knowledge. And how do we build on that? And when I talk about local contextual knowledge, I'm not just talking about kind of, very specific knowledge of a particular community and so on, which might be relevant in some types of economic research, but even just understanding of the macroeconomy, political economy, and so on, that someone sitting in another country might be able to run a bunch of regressions on your country, but might not be able to make sense of those. So how to build on that strength of contextual knowledge for high quality research. Secondly, in terms of funding, so obviously there are funding constraints, but there are a lot of funding and grants which are available. In some cases from kind of pure academic grants, in some cases more sort of development agencies, but it's still for research. In some cases they're specific for low-income countries or for LDCs. So I think sometimes it's about also just sharing of information about grants and funding opportunities that are out there. There are repositories and listservs and so on, and networks such as this one, I think, have an important role to play in sharing that kind of knowledge. And then linked to that is the importance of networking. YSI is a prime example of the success of that, and the Africa Working Group as well as other working groups. There's also other organizations like Africa Licks and so on, which there are opportunities for funding, for presenting research and so on. And then lastly, I thought, let me just take the opportunity as well to mention some specific things which are available at the moment. When we had our last event, when was it, in November? So I can't remember. And I mentioned that we had a call open at the time in my Center for Postdocs, and even the next day I got some applications from people who'd been on the call and were interested in that. So I thought, let me mention some opportunities here, and I'm going to post information about some of them in the chat as I talk. So the first one here is actually something which we just opened about 2 days ago. It's the Thandika Mkandawire Awards. This is in the second year of the awards. People will know the contribution of Thandika Mkandawire, one of the most eminent African scholars. And we have the awards this year in two categories, the Outstanding Scholarship Award and then the Young Scholars Award. And this year, learning from last year, we've actually bumped up a bit the age cutoff to being under 40 years. So at the link, you'll find information about the criteria and the prize and so on. And then secondly, there's the APPORD, African Program on Rethinking Development Economics, which I'm also on the committee of. The call is open right now for 2022. The event will be held in September. It's about a 2-week or so fully funded training opportunity. This year we're going back to doing it in person again, so long as conditions won't change, and try to bring in some of the leading scholars from around the world. It will be held here in South Africa for scholars from across Africa. And the details can be found at the link which I sent. Also have at the moment another call open for the TIPS Annual Forum, which is, so let me just give some dates. Well, the Mkandawire Prize is closing on the 22nd of May. APPORD is closing on 3rd of May. And the one which I've just posted now, the TIPS Annual Forum, is closing on the 29th of April. This is an opportunity to present research on trade and industrial policy. This year we have the theme of the green transition, or just transition, so anything in relation to green industrialization, green industrial policy, and so on. We also, I don't have the current link for this, but We Thinking Economics for Africa Festival, which will happen in September. This speaks to the kind of broader systemic transformation of economics. Heterodox economics, challenging orthodoxies, decolonizing curriculum, adapting curricula for the African context. These are all issues explored in WIFA. You can just Google it for past events. I hope to see some of you there. And then the Young Scholars Conference, this is something which myself and Richard are working on together and partnering between my center and YSI. The Young Scholars Conference on structural change in industrial development. I see Elvis is also on the call, he's also involved in the initiative. So we held the first conference last year, and we're currently in the planning stages of this year's conference. We hope to send out the call soon. Last year, we had about 39 presentations from different scholars from across Africa. It's open to anyone either from Africa or working on those themes in Africa, specifically for young scholars. And then, yeah, I think I'm kind of out of time, but we have a range of events coming up. On 28th of March, we're doing a book talk for Homan Chitonge's new book on industrial policy and industrial development in Zambia, and a couple of others. But yeah, let me not take more time talking about those. But I think those were some specific opportunities that I wanted just to draw to people's attention for African scholars. Yeah.
Thank you, Fiona. And I really think I must take this opportunity to celebrate the work that you and Richard are doing, particularly just the tip of the iceberg that you've mentioned to us. I know for a fact that you and Richard have been working together. And of course, I'm going to be working with you very soon. You'll expect a call from me. But I'm just going to try to wrap up quickly and just mention a few points. The critical point, the biggest point that I took from this conversation, I think came from some of what Fiona said, that while we have all of these challenges, we have all of these marvelous opportunities. And, you know, what she's just presented to us is an example of such opportunities, right? And I will say, by mentioning this is the platform to sort of acknowledge this. I have had the opportunity of organizing very good conferences funded by YSI, starting with one in 2016, which Richard attended, and where we actually first met and have then collaborated ever since. And in fact, Richard has gone on to do much bigger things than I could have ever have done through INET YSI, and that is so true even if you shake your head. But I also just wanted to flag just a few points. Let's take this opportunity to recognize the available opportunities, right? And also consider the fact that we have an important voice in terms of global affairs. I was involved in a discussion very recently with other colleagues elsewhere, talking about the effects. I would rather not say impact because, you know, we would need to measure it, but about the effects of the war between Russia and Ukraine on this part of the continent. And the vote in the UN has been such that Africa's position on this has been uneven. Does that necessarily mean that we are divided on the issue? I would say no. I would say this is where opportunities to try and understand the continent comes in. People are voting or providing perceptions about what's happening depending on whatever contextual considerations that they have. And those in some ways also speak to the challenges that we face as African scholars. We are coming from different African contexts, but there are certain things that we face which are which are not dissimilar when we are African scholars trying to operate on a global scale. I mean, when we go to important conferences, I mean, you hear of the African Studies Association. There's one based in the US. There's another African Studies Association based in Western Europe. It's only recently that scholars are beginning to talk about an African Studies Association being based on the African continent. That is important. if it's an African studies issue, why are we not at the center of the discussion as African scholars? Why are we not leading those discussions? Why are we going to discuss African issues being led by other people? Right? I can say the same for economic associations. This doesn't mean that we don't have local associations. I know we've got local/regional, particularly in history, we've got very good associations with for example, South African Historical Society or the Historical Association of South Africa. Those are really, really good associations that are doing extremely good work and hosting really good journals. But what we need to do is to expand the horizons to cover the entire continent and bring African issues to the core so that it doesn't remain, a bit regionalized to a certain extent. So these speak to some of the systemic issues that we're facing. There have been a number of questions that are raised, but those are for the corridors, questions of data collection, cultural inhibitions, issues of gender that we could have addressed. But what we are trying to do on this platform is to simply raise some of the issues, things that we can think about, but critically also to identify that while we have these challenges, the bigger point to be made is there are numerous opportunities to be taken up. And Fiona has just given examples of those. Those who are in my networks can also get in touch. We'll be happy to discuss whatever other opportunities are available. But this is just a beginning of things that we as African scholars can do. And my call to everybody is to say, please, let's come together. Let's try to do whatever we can to put Africa in the center of African conversations and allow African scholars of all color to be able to make whatever points or perspectives or publish whatever issues that they have to say about African issues. At this point, I need to hand back over to Nicolás and say thanks to Nicolás, Herdecke, Jay, and the INET YSI team for giving us the opportunity to discuss these issues. I think it's been a wonderful opportunity, and it's always wonderful to be in the company of these wonderful people in Fiona and Richard, who I hope to continue working with in the foreseeable future. So back over to you, Nicolás. And also to our audience, thank you also for being there.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much, Tinashe, and also Fiona, Richard, and the audience for being here. The session has been truly amazing. I take a lot with me, and I'm sure everyone who attended us. I'm sure we could have stayed way longer continuing this conversation, but I think that only means that we have to do it again soon and keep opening up this. But it's not all sad because the early career days continue. After short 15-minute breaks, we have our next session on PhD life and mental health issues. This is also an extremely important conversation as PhD students in economics report astonishingly high mental health issues compared to the population of their age. So we really need to start discussing what's going on with economic students and their mental health. So I'm really glad that we are having that. And in an hour from now, I'm saying this in time left because I know we are all in different time zones. So in an hour from now, we'll have a conversation on how to write and how to teach. Sorry, before forgotten to say that Anna Herdecke will lead the discussion on mental health issues. And in the session on how to write and how to teach, it will be led by Paul Dudenhofer, the part on how to write. And then the INET education team will lead the session on how to teach, and they will introduce some workshops that will take place shortly. Before we wrap this session up, I just want to say to the audience that the report that we wrote is very much an open document, and it has a session for you to add your feedback and your input to it. So if you want to share something with us and you want that experience to be incorporated in a future edition of the report, please take a look at the link that Herdecke shared and feel free to complete it. So thank you all so much for being here, and let's hope to see you in 15 minutes in the next conversation. Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.